Julian Vane was a man who hated the ocean. The smell of salt made him nauseous, and the sound of waves felt like a countdown he couldn't stop. But when his estranged grandfather, Silas, died and left him Blackrock Lighthouse on a jagged, nameless island off the coast of Maine, Julian had no choice. He was bankrupt, and the lighthouse was his only asset. The island was a lonely tooth of stone rising from a churning, black Atlantic. The locals in the nearby, mainland village of Oak Haven refused to take him all the way to the pier. "Don't stay after the sun goes down, Mr. Vane," the boatman warned, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "The tide doesn't just bring in water at Blackrock. It brings in the hungry." Julian ignored him. He climbed the winding, salt-slick path to the lighthouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old tallow and rotting seaweed. Silas had lived there for 50 years, yet there were no photos, no books, only thousands of handwritten journals. As night fell, Julian found the first journal on the kitchen table. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was frantic. October 14th. The rhythm has changed. It's no longer 12 hours. The sea is breathing slower now. Today, I found a fish on the doorstep with human teeth. I didn't throw it back. I know better now. You have to feed the tide, or the tide feeds on you. Julian scoffed, tossing the book aside. He climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room to check the light. The massive Fresnel lens was dark, coated in a strange, translucent slime that shimmered like oil. As he began to wipe the glass, he looked out at the dark water. The moon was full, illuminating the waves. But the waves weren't moving toward the shore. They were moving sideways, circling the island in a perfect, pulsating ring. Suddenly, the light in the room flickered to life on its own. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the water. In the circle of light, Julian saw them. Hundreds of pale, elongated figures were standing just beneath the surface of the water. They weren't swimming, they were standing upright, their long, white arms reaching upward. And they were all looking up at him, their mouths open in a silent, wide-eyed "oh." Then a wet, heavy thump sounded from the front door downstairs. The thump at the door was followed by a sound that made Julian's blood turn to ice. The wet, rhythmic dragging of something heavy across the stone floor downstairs. It sounded like a wet carpet being pulled over gravel. Julian scrambled to the trapdoor leading to the living quarters. He slammed it shut and bolted the iron latch just as a massive weight hit the door from below. The wood groaned, and a thin, translucent slime began to ooze through the cracks, the same oil-like substance he had seen on the lens. "Silas," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The only response was a low, gurgling vibration that rattled the floorboards. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of a lung filled with seawater trying to speak. Julian backed away, his heels hitting a heavy iron chest he hadn't noticed before. On top of it sat a ring of heavy brass keys, each etched with a different symbol: a wave, an eye, a spiral, and a closed mouth. Next to the keys lay a large, vellum map. He unrolled it with trembling hands. It didn't show the coast of Maine. It showed the island, Blackrock, but it was depicted as the highest peak of a sprawling, geometric nightmare of a city that lay beneath the waves. The map was labeled in Latin, Civitas Profunda, the deep city. According to the map, the lighthouse wasn't built to guide ships. It was the stopper. The light was a physical seal meant to keep the inhabitants of the city pinned to the seafloor. If the light fails, a note in the margin read, "The gates of the abyss swing outward." Julian looked out the gallery window. The standing men were no longer just in the water. They were emerging. Dozens of them were clinging to the sheer cliffs of the island, their spindly, multi-jointed limbs finding grip in the wet rock. They moved with a terrifying, insect-like speed, their pale skin glowing with a sickly bioluminescence. They weren't looking for a way in. They were heading for the external fuel valves at the base of the tower. They wanted to kill the light. A sudden crash echoed from the kitchen below. The front door had given way. The dragging sound was now moving up the spiral stairs. Thud, slap, thud, slap. Julian looked at the brass keys. He realized Silas hadn't left him an inheritance of wealth. He had left him a post at a prison. He grabbed the key with the closed mouth symbol and ran toward a small, reinforced hatch in the floor labeled the well. If the map was correct, the lighthouse was anchored directly into the throat of the sunken city, and there was a mechanism below that could lock the island's perimeter. But as he reached for the hatch, a long, pale hand with too many knuckles reached over the edge of the balcony. It didn't have fingernails. It had serrated ivory claws. The ivory claws scraped against the stone to sound like a diamond cutting glass. Julian didn't wait to see the face attached to the hand. He threw himself toward the hatch labeled the well, jammed the closed mouth key into the lock, and twisted. The iron plate swung open with a heavy groan, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped into absolute darkness. A rusted iron ladder disappeared into the depths. Without a second thought, Julian slid inside and slammed the hatch shut just as the pale thing from the cliffs vaulted over the balcony railing. The descent was a nightmare of vertigo. The air grew colder, smelling of ancient salt and something metallic, like old blood. As he climbed down, the walls of the lighthouse changed. The smooth Victorian brickwork gave way to jagged, non-Euclidean greenstone that felt warm and pulsed like a slow heartbeat. After descending nearly 50 feet, Julian reached a circular platform. In the center sat a massive brass mechanism, a forest of gears and pistons that hissed with steam. Standing over the gears was a figure draped in tattered oilskins. "Grandfather?" Julian whispered. The figure turned. It was Silas, but the man Julian remembered was gone. His skin had become translucent and leathery, stretched tight over a skull that seemed to have elongated. One of his eyes had been replaced by a glowing, amber crustacean-like orb, and a row of gills fluttered rhythmically along his neck. "You're late, boy," Silas gurgled. The sound didn't come from his mouth, it vibrated from gills. "The tide is high, and the great mouth is hungry. Did you bring the oil? What happened to you?" Julian backed away, his boots splashing in a pool of thick, black seawater. "The pressure," Silas said, gesturing to the floor. "The deeper you go into the truth, the more the world squeezes you. I'm not the keeper anymore, Julian. I'm the anchor. If I leave this platform, the lighthouse tips and the city below rises." Silas pointed to a massive lever at the edge of the platform. "The standing men are trying to cut the fuel valve above. If the light dies, the anchor breaks. You have to go further down into the sub-basement of echoes. You must restart the core pulse before the creatures breach the glass." "I can't go deeper," Julian yelled. "Look at you. I'll turn into that." "You're a Vane," Silas hissed, his amber eye flashing. "Our blood was brewed in the deep. You aren't turning into something else. You're finally becoming what you were born to be." Suddenly, the lighthouse shuddered. A massive impact from outside cracked the greenstone walls. A jet of high-pressure seawater blasted into the room, and with it came the first of the creatures, a spindly, white-skinned horror with a face that was nothing but a vertical slit of needle teeth. The spindly creature moved with a sickening, liquid grace, its needle teeth chattering like a telegraph. Silas lunged at it with a rusted harpoon, his movements surprisingly powerful for his distorted frame. "Go, Julian!" "Into the flood," Silas roared, the gills on his neck spraying a fine mist of seawater. Julian didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath and plunged into the dark, rising water at the edge of the platform. The cold was so intense it felt like a physical blow, a crushing weight that tried to squeeze the air from his lungs. He swam downward, guided by a faint, rhythmic thumping, the core pulse. As he descended, the water began to glow with a pale, bioluminescent blue. He realized he wasn't in a basement anymore. He was in a cathedral of bone and coral, built into the very foundation of the island. Thousands of skulls, not just human, but things with elongated jaws and extra eye sockets, were embedded in the walls. They weren't just decorations. As the pulse thrummed, the skulls vibrated, creating a haunting, low-frequency hum that Julian felt in his marrow. He reached a central pedestal where a massive, crystalline heart-shaped object was suspended by thick, pulsating veins of kelp. This was the core. It was turning gray, its rhythm faltering. Julian pulled the spiral key from his belt. He realized now it wasn't a key at all. It was a heavy, two-pronged brass tuning fork. A shadow fell over him. He looked up and saw 3 of the standing men swimming toward him. Their movements were effortless, their long fingers trailing through the water like sensory feelers. They didn't have eyes. They tracked the vibrations of his frantic heart. Julian remembered his grandfather's journals. You have to feed the tide, or the tide feeds on you. He struck the tuning fork against the crystalline core. Ding! The sound was deafening, even underwater. A massive wave of pure sound blasted outward, visible as a distortion in the water. The standing men were thrown backward, their translucent skin rippling and tearing from the frequency. But the core didn't restart. Instead, it let out a pained, hungry moan. Julian realized the singing wasn't a one-way street. The entity in the core needed a melody to follow, a human memory to anchor its rhythm. He pressed his forehead against the cold crystal and thought of the one thing he loved, the sound of his mother's piano in the dry, sun-drenched house of his childhood. He sang the memory into the stone. The core flared a brilliant, angry violet. The pulse doubled in strength. Thump, 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 thump. The lighthouse above groaned as the stopper re-engaged, but Julian felt a sharp pain in his chest. When he looked at his hand, his fingernails were gone, replaced by hard, ivory points. The inheritance was moving faster now. The violet flare from the core didn't just restart the pulse. It triggered a massive displacement of reality. A wall of sonic pressure expanded from the lighthouse base, pushing the Atlantic Ocean back with the force of a divine hand. Julian gasped as the water vanished around him, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vacuum. He fell 20 feet, landing on a bed of slick black silk. He scrambled to his feet, coughing up brine, and looked up. The sight was impossible. The ocean hadn't just receded. It stood in a towering, 300-foot wall of frozen water around the island, held back by the invisible core pulse. In the bowl of the dry seabed, the true face of the Civitas Profunda was revealed. It was a city of towers that looked like frozen smoke, twisted, spiraling structures of obsidian and green glass that seemed to have grown rather than been built. There were no streets, only bridges made of giant, bleached ribs of long-extinct sea monsters. The Eye, Julian whispered, looking at the map in his mind. At the center of the ruins stood the Temple of the Unspoken, a monolith shaped like a massive, inverted bell. According to Silas's notes, the Eye key held within the temple was the only thing that could focus the lighthouse beam to its full power. Without it, the standing men would eventually break through the sonic wall. Julian began to run across the seabed. The ground was littered with the treasures of 1,000 shipwrecks, gold coins, rotted galleons, and the skeletons of sailors. But the skeletons were moving. The standing men who had been caught in the dry zone weren't dead. They were twitching, their bodies struggling to adapt to the lack of pressure. As he reached the entrance of the temple, the air grew thick with a hum that made his nose bleed. He stepped inside and saw a pedestal of white coral. Sitting upon it was a sphere of polished obsidian, the Eye key. But the Eye wasn't unguarded. Coiled around the pedestal was a creature that looked like a cross between a human woman and a deep-sea eel. Her skin was a patchwork of iridescent scales and pale flesh, and her hair was a mass of thin, translucent tentacles. "A Vane returns," she hissed, her voice echoing inside Julian's skull. "Do you come to lock the door, or to join us in the dark?" Julian held the tuning fork out like a weapon. "I came for the key." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The key is not a stone, Julian. It is a sacrifice. To see the truth of the deep, you must give up the sight of the surface." She lunged, her tentacled hair lashing out. At the same moment, the wall of water surrounding the island began to tremble. The core pulse was weakening. The ocean was coming back. The eel woman's tentacles whipped through the air, snapping like leather cords. Julian ducked behind a pillar of fused bone, his heart hammering against his ribs, a rhythm that now felt more like the mechanical thump of the lighthouse than a human pulse. "You cannot keep the ocean out forever, Julian Vane," she hissed, her body coiling around the pedestal. "The deep is the world's true memory. The surface is just a dream that will eventually wake up." Julian looked at the obsidian sphere. It wasn't just stone, it was a lens, a concentrated point of pure, ancient perspective. He realized why his grandfather's eye had been an amber orb. The eye key wasn't meant to be carried in a pocket. It was meant to be worn. "I'm not here to dream," Julian growled. He lunged forward, not with the tuning fork, but with a shard of jagged glass he had snatched from the temple floor. In a moment of frantic, salt-driven madness, he did the unthinkable. He drove the shard toward his own left eye, the pain exploding into a white-hot sun in his mind. Before he could scream, he grabbed the obsidian sphere and pressed it into the empty, bleeding socket. The world didn't go dark. It opened. With the eye of the deep, Julian saw the temple not as ruins, but as a living organ. He saw the standing men as tragic, ancient citizens. And most importantly, he saw the wall of water outside, the massive 300-foot cliff of the Atlantic beginning to crack. Crack! A sound like a mountain breaking echoed through the seabed. The sonic barrier was failing. "Run, little warden!" the eel woman shrieked, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and glee. Julian bolted from the temple. Behind him, a mile away, the wall of water collapsed. 1 trillion tons of black ocean came rushing back into the bowl of the seabed, a foaming, roaring apocalypse of salt and death. He ran across the silt, his new eye guiding him. He didn't see the obstacles. He saw the path of least resistance in the air currents. He reached the base of Blackrock Lighthouse just as the first wave of the returning tide smashed into the cliffs. The force of the impact nearly threw him into the abyss, but his hands, now clawed and ivory hard, tore into the stone, anchoring him. He hauled himself up the outer wall, climbing with the speed of the creatures he had once feared. Below him, the city of the Unspoken was swallowed once more. The white foam churned, and the pressure returned with a violent, bone-crushing weight. Julian reached the gallery of the lantern room, dripping with blood and seawater. He looked in the massive Fresnel lens. The light was dying, the oil-like slime almost completely covering the glass. He stood before the light, the obsidian eye in his skull beginning to glow with a fierce, violet fire. Julian stood before the massive Fresnel lens, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The obsidian eye in his socket didn't just see, it projected. A searing violet heat radiated from his skull, melting the translucent slime off the glass in seconds. He gripped the brass handles of the light assembly. As his eyes synchronized with the lens, the dim yellow glow of the lighthouse was replaced by a concentrated, coherent beam of violet hard light. He swung the light out toward the churning Atlantic. The beam didn't just illuminate the waves. It acted like a physical blade. When the light hit the standing men clinging to the cliffs, they didn't just fall, they were disintegrated. The hard light sliced through their bioluminescent flesh, turning them into clouds of gray ash that were instantly swallowed by the storm. "I see you now," Julian whispered, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "I see everything." With the obsidian eye, his vision extended beyond the horizon. He saw that Blackrock wasn't the only stopper. Across the globe, from the coast of Ireland to the Mariana Trench, other lights were flickering. Other wardens, other veins, were fighting or failing. But then, the light revealed something higher. Behind a main lens, a hidden gear clicked into place. The ceiling of the lantern room began to retract, revealing a platform Julian had never seen. The observation deck of the gods. He climbed the final ladder. Up here, there was no glass, only the freezing wind and the roaring spray. From this vantage point, the obsidian eye showed him the truth of the invasion. The standing men weren't the army. They were the refugees. Deep below the city of the Unspoken, something much larger was waking up. Julian looked down into the black heart of the ocean and saw a massive, undulating shadow that stretched for miles. It was a creature of tentacles and teeth, so vast that the island of Blackrock was merely a pebble on its back. The lighthouse wasn't a prison for the city. It was a leash for the great beast. Suddenly, the lighthouse groaned. The great beast was shifting its weight. The entire island tilted at a terrifying 45-degree angle. Julian, he looked down the trapdoor. His grandfather, Silas, was dragging himself onto the deck. He was almost entirely transformed now. His legs had fused into a powerful, muscular tail, and his skin was the color of deep-sea trenches. The leash is snapping. Silas roared over the wind. The core pulse isn't enough anymore. The beast has tasted the violet light, and it wants the source. Silas pointed to Julian's Obsidian Eye. You aren't just the warden anymore, Julian. You are the bait. From the dark water below, a tentacle the size of a cathedral spire rose into the air, dripping with glowing plankton, and began to wrap itself around the base of the lighthouse. The lighthouse leaned further, the stones screaming as the massive tentacle constricted. Julian felt the vibrations in his teeth. This wasn't just a monster. It was a tectonic force, a living god of the abyss that had decided to shrug off its chains. You can't kill it, Julian, Silas yelled. His gills flared in the freezing spray. You can't kill the ocean. You have to direct it. Julian understood. The lighthouse wasn't a weapon. It was a bit in a horse's mouth. The core pulse he had restarted earlier wasn't a heartbeat. It was a control signal. But the signal was weak because it lacked a pilot. I have to go back to the well, Julian said, his obsidian eye pulsing with a rhythmic violet light that matched the beast's own bioluminescence. No, Silas hissed, grabbing Julian's arm with a webbed hand. The well is flooded. The pressure down, they will crush your human lungs in seconds. You'll never reach the core. I'm not human anymore, grandfather, Julian replied. He looked at his hands. The ivory claws were now fused with the same green stone as the lighthouse walls. His skin was cold, leathery, and he no longer felt the need to shiver. Julian leapt. He didn't use the stairs. He dived over the railing of the observation deck, a 300-foot drop into the churning white foam at the base of the tower. As he hit the water, the Obsidian Eye flared. Instead of drowning, Julian felt a surge of power. The water didn't feel like a liquid. It felt like an extension of his own nervous system. He swam with terrifying speed, straight into the jagged hole in the lighthouse's foundation. The subbasement of echoes was now a vortex of wreckage. The core was spinning wildly in its kelp harness, glowing a panicked, strobing red. The great beast's tentacle had pierced the outer wall, and the standing men were flooding in, not to attack, but to hide from the very thing they served. Julian reached the core. The pressure was immense, enough to flatten a steel tank, but his body, reinforced by the inheritance, held firm. He didn't use the tuning fork this time. He reached out and grabbed the crystalline heart with both hands. The violet fire from his obsidian eye surged down his arms, knitting his flesh to the crystal. Connection established. A voice whispered in the back of his mind. It wasn't Silas, it was the beast. The beast wasn't evil. It was ancient and hungry, and for 10,000 years, it had been blind. It had been thrashing in the dark, and the lighthouse had been nothing but a painful needle in its side. Julian leaned his head forward until the obsidian eye touched the surface of the core. Click! The world turned inside out. Julian's consciousness expanded. He was no longer a man in a basement. He was the lighthouse. He was the island. And he was the 5-mile-long entity coiling beneath it. He saw through the beast's eyes, thousands of heat-sensing pits along its flank. He felt the cold currents of the Atlantic as if they were his own breath. With a roar that shook the seabed, Julian, as the beast, uncoiled from the lighthouse. He didn't rise to destroy the world. He turned his massive, mountain-sized head toward the deep trench and began to swim, pulling the island of Blackrock behind him like a ship. As Julian, now fused with the core, steered the great beast toward the sanctuary of the Midnight Zone, he felt a jagged, artificial vibration in the water. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of the ocean or the song of the standing man. It was the cold, clinical hum of high-frequency sonar. Through the beast's thermal sensing pits, Julian saw them, a fleet of sleek, black submersibles approaching from the continental shelf. They bore the logo of Mnemonic Solutions. They weren't here to save Oakhaven. They were here to harvest. Target acquired. A voice crackled through the beast's nervous system, intercepted by Julian's Obsidian Eye. The Great Hunger frequency is at maximum. Prepare the neural harpoons. We need that raw primordial dread for the elite markets. The subs fired. Long, carbon fiber spears tipped with glowing blue injectors hissed through the water, slamming into the beast's flank. These weren't meant to kill. They were data drains designed to suck the emotional essence directly out of the creature's prehistoric brain. The beast shrieked, a sound that caused a minor earthquake on the mainland. Its massive body began to thrash, its primal instincts screaming to surface and crush everything in sight. No! Julian roared internally, his mind battling the beast's rising fury. If we surface, the world dies. We have to go deeper. But the neural harpoons were working. Julian felt a cold, numbing sensation spreading through his mind. Mnemonic Solutions was editing the beast, trying to force it into a state of blind, controllable rage. They wanted a catastrophe so they could record the terror of 1 million people. Julian, they're hacking the link. Silas's voice echoed from the lighthouse above. The old man was clinging to the railing as the tower pitched violently. They're trying to turn the Warden into a transmitter. Julian looked through the Obsidian Eye and saw the lead sub, a massive, shark-shaped vessel. Inside, he could see the gray-suited technicians and the glowing tanks ready to be filled with ancient terror. He made a choice. He wouldn't just direct the beast. He would overload the harpoons. He opened this sub-basement of echoes in his mind, reaching for the darkest, most painful memory he had, the moment he realized he was truly alone in the world. He fed that concentrated, human loneliness into the beast's nervous system and sent it back up the harpoon lines. The blue injectors turned a violent, screaming violet. On the mnemonic subs, the monitors exploded. The technicians clutched their heads, weeping as they were suddenly hit with the crushing weight of 10,000 years of oceanic solitude. The black subs lost power, their guidance systems fried by the sheer emotional density of Julian's sacrifice. The beast, freed from the parasitic drain, let out a low, vibrating hum of gratitude. It dove, its massive tail fin creating a whirlpool that dragged the mnemonic subs down into the crushing depths where no human could survive. But the strain was too much. The green stone of the lighthouse began to crack. The island was breaking apart. The foundation of Blackrock Lighthouse was no longer stone. It was a living, pulsing extension of Julian's own nervous system. The tower groaned, the mortar turning into bone as the great beast dived deeper into the Hadal Zone, the darkest, deepest trenches of the earth where the pressure is enough to turn steel into foil. Julian, the tower can't take the depth. Silas cried out. He was standing in the lantern room, his tail fin twitching as the air became thick and heavy. If we go any further, the glass will shatter and the sea will claim everything. I know. Julian's voice resonated through the very floorboards. It was no longer a human voice. It was the vibration of the tectonic plates. That's why you have to leave, grandfather. I've spent 50 years waiting for a replacement. Silas argued, but his webbed hands were shaking. I won't leave you to the dark. You aren't leaving me to the dark, Julian replied, his obsidian eye flashing with a soft, protective violet. I am the dark now. I am the Warden of the Deep. But someone needs to go back to Oakhaven. Someone needs to tell the world that the ocean isn't just water. It's a memory that must be respected. With a sudden, powerful surge of the core pulse, Julian ejected the top section of a lighthouse, the lantern room, into a pressurized bubble of air. It acted like a life pod, shooting upward toward the distant, shimmering surface of the Atlantic. Silas watched through the glass as the rest of the island, and the man his grandson had become, vanished into the abyss. Julian felt the pressure settle over him like a warm blanket. At 30,000 feet below sea level, the light of the sun was a myth. He steered the great beast into the heart of the Challenger Deep. There, in the silent, freezing mud of the trench, Julian commanded the beast to rest. He anchored the remains of the lighthouse into a cleft of ancient basalt. The core pulse slowed down, becoming a gentle, rhythmic hum, a lullaby for the monster that could destroy civilizations. Julian sat on his throne of green stone, his body now completely part of the architecture. His obsidian eye remained open, a single, unblinking violet star at the bottom of the world. He could see everything. He saw the whales singing above. He saw the mnemonic solution's satellites burning up in the atmosphere as their company collapsed. And he saw Silas being rescued by a fishing boat, looking back at a patch of ocean that was now strangely calm. The whispering tide was silent at last. Julian Thorne, the man who hated the sea, had become its heart. And as long as his light stayed violet, the beast would sleep, dreaming of the man who gave up the sky to save the world.